Si tomamos fotos en el departamento para el webpage, entonces.
Should we go? Yeah. Okay, so good morning, everyone, to the Brownman seminars, World Bank, Monash, and BNM. Today we have the honor to have Chang Liu, who is an assistant professor at National University of Singapore, and he did his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he graduated in 2020. And he specialized in macroeconomics, especially in monetary and fiscal issues. And today he's gonna present his paper, Public Financing Under Balanced Budget Rules. So thanks a lot for being here. As usual, we're gonna have 1 hour. If there are any questions, just feel free to ask. And the floor is all yours. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It's a huge pleasure to be invited here. So I'm going to talk about the impact of the fiscal rule, in particular, balanced budget rule on public financing. Hopefully, it's it's to the interest of the World Bank and for the rest of the audience as well. It's a joint paper with Min Jie from Simon Fraser, and it's also part of my research agenda that looks at macro issues from a more regional perspective, and you will see how. All right, so over the past few years, especially after COVID, a lot of countries have accumulated a lot of debt to stimulate the economy and using expansionary fiscal policies. And there are a lot of debates on the pros and cons of using fiscal rules to deal with the high debt burden issue. And of course, the benefit of that is it makes the government more disciplined, which may have implications for a more healthier, fiscal system, as well as a lower debt burden, etc. And that comes with a cost, which has been studied in the literature. Basically, that is good, right? So we use that to smooth the economy, and in the form of a countercyclical fiscal policies, right? But so if you have imposed some rules, that might have negative implications for the economy as a whole. And so different from previous studies, the empirical work on the impact of fiscal rules is kind of hard to do. So for several reasons. One is that there's no good quality data on fiscal rules. There are data on fiscal rules from IMF and different countries, but when it comes to empirical studies, different countries, they're so different from each other, and it's very hard to control for all the factors that could potentially affect the outcome variable. So then people, instead of looking at across country, they look at within a country, across regions. But for the regional level fiscal rules, there's no good data. So that's what I mean by no good data sets. And also related to that, the fiscal rule then itself is a highly endogenous thing. Right? It's driven by different factors, including the state of the economy, the regime, the government, etc. So it's kind of hard to identify the impact of fiscal rules on different things. And our paper takes one step further to solve those issues. Yes. Yeah. Okay. And also in the previous studies, people, it's usually in the 1990s, not so many recent decades. They mostly focus on the, the impact of imposing a fiscal rule on the volatility of the economy, right? So for the reason I just highlighted that, the drawback of fiscal rule is that it, limits the countercyclical fiscal policies. So that might have a positive impact on the volatility of the economy and the business cycle. So those are the focus of the previous studies. And in this research, we are going to focus on the impact of fiscal rules on government financing costs. So that's the main thing that we are interested in. And then we build a model to study how that fits in or factors into the impact of fiscal rules on the government balance sheet as a whole.
And in this context, how should I think of fiscal rules? So because you could imagine, are you thinking of them as a broad set of principles that say the central bank puts out, but compliance is endogenous, or what's a fiscal rule exactly here? Do you have some specific examples for me?
So in this paper, we exclusively study balanced budget rules, which has huge variation across different states. So you mentioned the compliance thing. We were not so careful, so to speak, in thinking about, I guess what you have in mind is like a commitment issue, right? Or the government has some rule whether the government will
comply with it or not. It's exactly like throwing trash, In Singapore, you know that the rule works. In India, it doesn't, right?
Yeah. So in the context of the US, it's written in the law, and for the state government, and so I would say that concern is less pronounced there than in, for example, as you said, in India or other countries. So that's why in this paper we're not so serious about those kind of compliance. Usually we just take it for granted that once there's a rule, or it's going to have an impact. You're going to comply with it.
Okay.
So an overview of this paper, there are two parts. The first part is empirical. So basically, to deal with the data problem, we construct a state-level data set on the balanced budget rules that allows for both, of course, cross-state variation and time variation. And I will more specific about that later. So of course, our goal is to study the impact of balanced budget rule on the financing costs. We have to construct, the borrowing costs for each newly issued state government debt. Okay, so that's the two main data that we construct and use in the empirical. And so the main finding, not surprisingly, is that in states with the tighter BBRs, balanced budget rules, they are associated with much less, much lower state government financing cost measured by the bond spreads. Okay, so basically that's the difference between the interest rate or the interest rate associated with the newly issued bonds and the risk-free rates. And to better understand the channel, we use the CDS data and find similar things, right? So for states that have balanced budget rules, they have a much lower CDS. And by the way, so CDS is a direct factor of default risk. Right? So using this, we highlighted the channel, which is the default channel. Okay? So in other words, the reason why fiscal rules lower borrowing costs is because they lower the default risk of local governments.
And just the clarification, so now, for instance, when COVID happened in the United States, so now then the laws were rewritten for the states to be able to inject a lot more money into the economy to overcome downturns, or what was the procedure then followed if suddenly a state wanted to pump in money to boost the economy?
Yeah. So, sorry. So So there are difference between states with this rule and states without this rule. For states with this rule, they still have to comply with the balanced budget rule. So in other words, the hands are more tied in doing the kind of stimulations that you mentioned. But for those that don't have this kind of rule, they are more flexible. So that's the that's the interpretation of this rule in the context of COVID.
And as a reflection, we observe in the data that states which had tighter balanced budget rules, for instance, in the last 2 years, ran much more balanced budgets as compared to states which did not have these rules.
We didn't specifically look at the last 2 years. So data ends at, I think, 2020.
That would be a good test of your assumption of, in some sense, looking at shocks to see how well states comply with it, to say whether the law rules really have bite, because in normal terms, of course, that could be the case, but that would be a good test of your assumption.
Yeah. So it's like an event study, right? That would be interesting. So that's the empirical part. It's, as I said, not very surprising. For the quantitative part, right? So because of the default channel, so we built a sovereign default model to kind of study the impact of incorporating or imposing a balanced budget rule on various things, including the borrowing cost, of course, and the government debt, measured by the government debt spread. We find that it lowers the debt spread. And we are also interested in the balance sheets of the government. For example, the debt level, right? And this one is also not very surprising, decreases. And together, these two things combined, the debt burden, right, measured by the interest payment, also fall. And when it comes to welfare, it becomes quite interesting. So we find that in the short run, in the first several years, after introducing a balanced budget rule, the welfare actually decreases. So that's related to the cons of balanced budget rules. Basically, you impose an additional constraint that limits the fiscal capacity. But in the longer run, the welfare increases. This is mainly due to healthier balance sheet, right? The lower borrowing costs, lower debt burden, so there are more resources are freed up for consumption, so to speak. So this kind of decrease in the short run and increase in the long run, I think is it's very relevant for the policy. Right? So there are, as I said, a lot of people argue that fiscal rules may be bad for the economy, tie the hands of the government. But because of the specific channel that we identified, the foreign cost and the debt burden, they are actually good for the economy in the long run. Okay? So that's I think is a quite interesting takeaway. And asked by the referees, we had to put a lot of unnecessary ingredients in the model. For example, what if you consider federal government transfer in the model? It turns out it's not so different. And also, here in this paper, we specifically look at balanced budget rule, but in practice, there are other kind of rules like debt rule, deficit rule, etc. So we also consider different the effects of different fiscal rules. They can be very different.
Sorry, just a clarifying question on this. There is no distortionary taxation, right? Okay.
No.
So, I was trying to understand model here. So how, once you have explained that in the data, that each state some kind of heterogeneity across the balanced budget rule, does it first some states are PBR are fine? I just want to understand what is a policy, what is kind of policy parameters like model and how to like incorporate say contributing change across states?
So in the model, we only have one state. So it's a small open economy. So, and in the calibration exercise, we specifically look at one state, which is Illinois, for reasons I will come later. And so we don't have like cross-state heterogeneity in a more complicated framework, because sovereign default model, as far as I understand, is already very difficult to solve. So let alone you have many regions. So so that's why we abstract from that and follow the standard by considering a small open. Yeah, and of course, a more realistic model would be to have an aggregate economy with a lot of different regions, subject to different rules, but that would be too much for this purpose. All right, so very quickly, so how we differentiate from the previous work. As I said, there are papers that look at balanced budget rules, especially state-level balanced budget rules, but they are more interested in things like the output volatility, etc. So here our focus is on borrowing costs. Right? So that's our main focus, and associated with that, the balance, the government balance sheet. And in terms of the quantitative exercise, I think our main contribution is to combine the empirical with the quantitative framework and study the dynamics of the dynamic impact of introducing fiscal rule on the like welfare, borrowing cost, debt burden, etc. So that's different from the previous work. All right, so come to the data. Two things that are key for this project. One is how to measure balance budget. Right? So as I said, we looked at U.S. states, and it turns out that states are very heterogeneous in terms of balance budget rules. So that's a good laboratory to study this particular question. But when it comes to balanced budget rule, you can Google it. It's very vague and very there's no consensus on how to measure the tightness of the balanced budget rules. So generally, they fall under two categories. The first one is it's just no deficit carryover. Right? So it states explicitly that state government are not allowed to carry over the deficit to the next fiscal year. So that's and we look for this kind of rules. And this is our main measure for balanced budget rule. At the same time, kind of related to your question, in terms of implementation, right? There are different levels of legal requirements. Some of them said, the governor is required to submit a balanced budget. And there are other states that says the legislature are required to pass a balanced budget. And the third category, the budget signed by the government required to be balanced. And they can be constitutional or federal. So those are the different levels in the legal system. And we, in our second measure of BBR, we put different points based on how tight is the legal requirements. Okay. The data source is from the historical PDF file, for sample pair, we don't have a continuous sample because these reports are not published every year, only for several years, and for some of the years in which they publish these reports, there's no information on the fiscal rules. So we took out those years as well. And one thing I want to highlight is that different from previous studies in which they just they look at particularly, for example, 1987, and assume that this kind of fiscal rule is just constant over time. We find that this is not the case in all of those. We find that they actually change a lot over the years. So that's another thing that is different. So two measures. The first one is whether the state government allows deficit carryover. Right? So this is a dummy variable. And for the second measure, we call that our index. It's motivated from a report in 1987, in which they put different points to different requirements. So of course, the most weight is put to this criteria. And for those legal requirements, they put lesser weight, but they can vary across, for example, whether it's constitutional or statutory. And here's a summary of our two measures. The first one, right? In 1986. So by the way, you noted there's a 1-year lag because the report is published in 1987, and we took 1 year from that and argued that reflects 1986. So in 1986, there were 40 states with a balanced budget rule measured by this, or 40 states that explicitly stated that no deficit is carryover allowed. And over the years, there are less, more, less. So there's a time variation in this requirement. And for this index, right? So here is not, it looks like it's not so different across years, but remember, here we take the average, and second, the most weight is put on the no deficit carryover, and for the majority of the state, they do have that requirement. So that's why you find that this is not very different across the US. So let me show you just some pictures. This is the second measure, which we call the tightness of PDR in 2020 across the different states. So 10 is the state with the most strict form of PDR, and there is one state with 0. There's no legal requirement. There's no, deficit carryover, no deficit carryover requirement. So this state is Vermont, and for many states, they have very tight form of balanced budget rules. And for other states, right, for example, this one, and it's Arizona and others, they're not as tight as those states with 0.10. Okay, so this is a cross-state variation in the tightness. So in the empirical world, we're going to leverage both cross-state and cross-time variation.
Just have a quick question about the balanced budget rule. So, like Vermont doesn't have it. Was it removed, or they just historically did not have this balanced budget rule?
I need to check.
Okay.
I need to check. So this is only for 2020.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we go back to the previous figure, then in terms of the historical no deficit carryover, is it because some states do remove their BBR over time and
yes, yes.
Yeah.
So I have I think the next picture. Yes, this is asked by the editor. So this is a histogram of the number of BBR changes over time. Okay. So basically, it captures. So in the sample that we have, how many states have, or for each individual state, how many times have they switched between no and yes? Okay. For nearly half of the states, they didn't change. Okay? There are quite a number of states that have changed at least once. And some states may even change many times from the sample that we have. And this is, I should say, this is a lower bound of their change in the fiscal rule because we only have a limited number of years. So we can only tell that this is the minimum. Okay. So in practice, they may change that even more.
And my second follow-up question was to maybe understand the balanced budget a little bit more. So they have a rule about what's the amount that they can have. When you mentioned the 3 different types of rules that they have, where do you actually pass to increase the budget for state level when they went over and then they just go through legislation to change their budget for that year so that they don't have the carryover deficit, or is that how you measure tightness, I guess?
You are referring to the endogenous, right? The endogeneity of fiscal rules. So in the data, in practice, there must be some cases like that. In the data, it's very hard to tell whether they pass or whether they change the fiscal rule because of their worsened fiscal condition. So we didn't really explore that much, but I'm pretty sure in practice there must be cases like that, right? So the economy is doing very bad, the fiscal situation is very bad, so they changed those kind of rules. So that could happen. And actually, the endogeneity of fiscal rule is a huge threat to improve forward, and we try to account for that using different methods. All right, so I'm not going to be to talk too much about this. Basically, we measure the state government bond spread using this data sets, and this data set basically records all the municipal and state level newly issued government debts. Okay, and now because it's very raw data, we have to do data cleaning in order to construct a spread measure. Okay, and one thing is that different states they are subject to different taxes, right? And the place where the bond is issued may so the difference in the spreads across different states may be partly driven by the difference in the tax rates, right? So we have to account for those as well. And eventually, we construct a measure of the tax-adjusted yield of state government bonds. Okay, so that's our main measure for spreads. And this, I think I can just skip this one. So basically, this shows compare the states with deficit carryover and without deficit carryover. What is their average? For most of the years, right? For example, this one for states that do have a BDR, they have a smaller spread, but there are exceptions. Like this one and this one, but again, this is just descriptive, and there's really nothing more informative. So then let's move on to the empirical part. One thing I want to highlight about state level estimation is that different from cross-country studies in which there are many work on that, because of we only have good data on the country level fiscal rules. State level estimations have the advantage of it's easier to control for the policy changes over time. Right? For example, like monetary policy would affect the spread, and many other national level policies would affect this. So in a cross-state regression, it's easy to capture all of those common policy changes in a time fixed event. Okay. But if you do cross-country studies, it's very hard to argue that you can control all the policy changes, right? So each country has its individual country level policy changes over time, and it's very hard to exhaust all the possibilities. So that's why this is part of my research agenda, that basically using the regional level data to make better estimations of macro questions. Okay? So that's something I want to highlight. Okay. And also, of course, it has an advantage over the time series studies. Right? There are also papers that look at within a country, there's time variation in the tightness of fiscal rule. And as we know, there are a lot of homogeneity issues for time series studies. Okay? All right, so the specification, right? So the left-hand side is a spread that we measure for each newly issued government debt. And this is a state level balanced budget rule measure, either measure 1 or measure 2. And this is a bunch of this is a bunch of loan level and debt level and state level control variables. So what are they? So like the bond characteristics, the maturity, coupon, etc., and also the most standard factors that affect like default risk and the spread. For example, debt to GDP ratio, the state of the economy, the fiscal variables, etc. Okay, and this gamma T, as I said, captures the common time varying factors, including the policy changes, and this in the state levels.
Just a clarifying question about the spread. The spread is the difference between the state government bond and what else? Sorry, what is the definition of a spread here? Is the difference between the...
And the risk of, is the treasury rate, the risk-free rate.
Okay, but at the national level?
Yes.
Okay, the state against national level?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's our definition.
And so now, in this specification, so at some level, by accounting for your controls and your time and state fixed effects, you are assuming that the transitions in the budget balance rules you're treating them as exogenous now for your interpretation.
That's why we have additional exercise.
You have additional exercise. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, so the main thing that we should look at is probably column 4 and column 8, so in which we control for everything, okay, and all the state, all the fixed effects, and the different control variables. So for the first measure, the no deficit carryover, for states with BBR, right, they are associated with much less spread. Okay, and also for this one, for states with a tighter BBR measured by this index, we also have smaller spreads. Okay, so that's the main takeaway. I probably shouldn't put so many columns. And as you said, there are some concerns about endogeneity and how we address that. We look at different. There's no perfect way to deal with this endogeneity issue. We follow the practice in some papers. Basically, we use the previous 1 or 2 years government surplus as an instrument. So the idea is that if you run government deficits, right, you run a huge deficit, you're likely to react, right, by changing the fiscal rule, right, to deal with the problem. Okay, so that's the core, the relevance part, right. So this IV is relevant to the fiscal rule. And also, it's probably not it's not correlated with the residual factors that affect the borrowing costs today. So remember, so residual here is the state level, even a bond issue level residual factor at time t, right? And the idea here is that, if you think about the asset price, think of asset prices as kind of forward-looking, it's probably not so much driven by the past, the past government surpluses or deficits. So that's the identical assumption. So of course it's not not a perfect one, but that's something that we do, and we find that the result is the same.
If let's say like in your previous specification, right, you were controlling for some things at time t, right? And I was already wondering, with how quickly does the things taken into account, in terms of if you would put in lags, right? In your previous specification for the controls you were suggesting that you wanted to account for, do they all turn out to be insignificant?
You mean for all the control variables just put lags?
Exactly, for instance, right? Again, that would be a direct test of your identifying exclusion restriction, right? Although I can see that's a very thorny problem to solve, right? But that would buy mine at least some kind of credibility in terms of thinking about it, because I can think of several examples where you might say that, hey, I care about how did Argentina perform in the last years before I think, okay, this year it has a balanced surplus, right? Or similarly for, say, debt-ridden countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But history does make an important role in me thinking about how I should make my decisions in the future. But yeah, this is
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I don't think we've tried putting lags or even 2-year lags on the right hand side, but we did do like this automated test for these ideas. So that seems to work okay. And we also tried different measures of BVR. We had different control variables, for example, different states, they have different political regimes, so they might be very different in driving the results of borrowing costs, etc. And also, like dependency ratio is motivated by a recent paper, and also the size of rainy day funds. So those are it's like a reserves, which they can take when they need them. Okay. The size of that, it turns out that the size of this rainy day fund doesn't really matter. All right, so as I said, we need to inspect what is going on in the impact of BVR on the borrowing cost. And our hypothesis is that maybe it reduces the default risk. So then we just look at the default channel and use the CDS spread as a measure of the default risk component. And so because the CDS data is available only very recently, and we only have several years of root data, we cannot really do a panel study. So this is a pooled OS regression, and we find that indeed it seems that the balanced budget rule lowers the default risk. Okay, now so that's pretty much about the empirical part, and then the next step is to quantify, the dynamic impact of introducing BVR on the government balance sheet and welfare. So because of the default channel, we built a sovereign default model for a particular state, which is considered as a small economy, and so everything is pretty much standard, except for two things. One is that, of course, we now explicitly look at the impact of the balanced budget rule, which is non-existing in previous works. And second, this is also asked by the referee. We didn't have the endogenous capital before. Previously, we only had the endowment economy. The referee said it's too straightforward. So we want something more involved. We want to look at some trade-off. So we include the endogenous capital and outputs into a sovereign. All right. So the economy has access to technology that uses capital and productivity is given by this AT, and it follows AR1 process. And every, the household utility is standard. So the local governments, right, they borrow long-term. In the data, we find that most governments borrow long-term instead of very short period. So we just model the long-term bond. And the government can choose to pay, or if they default, there's going to be a productivity loss from A to AD. This AD is given by this thing. It's also from the literature. So once the government defaults, right, again, same as in the literature, the government is excluded from the borrowing market, but there's a probability lambda of going back to the credit markets. And the government also makes a capital adjustments, capital investment decisions facing adjustment cost. So that's pretty much the setup. And for the problem of the government, right? The main decision is to choose whether to default or to continue to repay. So this is the problem. And now we need to specify VC and VB, right? So if the government does not default, given by this the value function given by this VC, it basically solves this problem. This is the household utility, and this is the next period's value function. So remember, next period can be has a default state or non-default state. This is really determined by your default decision in the previous period. Okay. And they're subject to the budget constraints. This is a household budget constraint. Okay, household consumption. This is a transfer from governments, and this is the after tax income. Okay, so this is the capital. Okay. The government's budget constraint looks like this, but for now, we can probably just assume this V is equal to 1, right? If V is equal to 1, it's a short-term bond. It's easier for us to understand, right? So if V is equal to 1, right, this term is bound, and this is basically how much the government borrows, right? And this is the tax collected from the capital owners, and they make a decision on investment. And also, they have to repay the debt. Okay. So in general, this really is between 0 and 1, which captures the long-term bond, and this is the general case.
But then there is distortionary taxation, right? Because the tax is affecting the capital decision, or not?
Yes. Somehow we didn't really discuss. The distortionary effect. I'm trying to remember.
Because I think that could be crucial for the mechanism, because if you have high deficit, that also implies that tomorrow you're gonna tax more, right? Because the recurrent equivalence. And then this taxation actually reduce investment. And that gives you a direct mechanism of how budget balance rules can actually reduce spreads and increase investment and increase consumption and welfare in the long term. No?
So I'm not super sure whether this is the correct answer, but somehow I think it's incorporated in the transfers to the household, in the sense that there may be profits of operating the the production process, and eventually everything is transferred to the household. I'm not super sure about the distortionary factor of pi, because eventually we didn't really talk about pi. So that's why I thought that
Okay, maybe because then you solve this just taking into account all the resource constraint, and then the tax will just go, right? If you put together the.
Let me show you the. I think there's. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. So especially in the case of bands like you, eventually there's no how term there. I have to think more carefully about the intuition, the mechanism that you have, because I've never thought that.
Okay.
And to be honest, in the previous version, we didn't have the power. We just have a T.
Yeah, but in the previous version there is no capital.
Yeah, there's no capital.
But with capital, I think it's different.
Yes. Okay, thanks. And of course, there's
is like risk aversion is essential in this model?
You mean for households?
Yeah, household. Because like you have like decreasing return like technology introduction.
Yeah.
Internal solution. Probably you could get from that.
You mean just log into?
Yeah, you definitely want to like avoid like a corner solution like zero capital or like capital like
yeah.
Yeah. Because if you want to explain some risk premium like in the long pricing, that could like be essential, but for me like
So there are two things. Here the households, right? We have this risk averse parameter, and then for the investors, the investors are risk neutral, right? So the investors, you think about that as the rest of the states, right? They are risk neutral, which is standard in the sovereign default literature. So in that regard, it's not necessary really to yeah, that's right. That it has welfare implications, but it's probably not necessary for the mechanism. It's more like important for the quantitative exercise. All right. And if the government defaults, right, they're going to face this problem. With probability lambda, that they can go back to the credit market, and with probability 1 minus lambda, they just stay in a default state. Okay, and if they're in a default state, of course they cannot borrow. This is their their resource constraints, and as well as the capital adjustment equations. Okay, so those are pretty much standard setup. And then in this model, we can write down the pricing equation for for the bonds as well as the spread. Okay, so this D is basically the indicator for default, right? If it defaults, then everything is just zero. There's no value for the bonds. And then if it does not default, right? D is zero, and then there's value for the bonds. And the spread is just calculated as this, right? In the long-term bond scenario.
Is it really true in the data that like state the government bond when they default, like they get like exactly zero?
That's related to like partial default or complete default. In this model, we don't have partial defaults.
Yeah. The question is more in the data.
So in fact, that's actually a good point. In fact, in the data, we have not observed the default for states since, I think, early 20th century, in which there's one state, I forgot the name, that defaulted. But for decades, there's no default case. But there are papers that show that the bond spread is largely driven by default risk. Okay, so in other words, for a long time there's no default, but still investors are worried about a default in the future. So so back to your question, it's very hard to really link the model with the data because there's no default case for many decades. And here we just use the most standard framework to illustrate that the point that default risk can be an important part of the spread.
It says that you have data for both the spreads and the CDS. Mm-hmm. So the model, it could like predict the model like generally default probability and the spreads. Then if you might use the data to infer or like estimate or calibrate the recovery, even if you like see the default. Because that spreads could like also like include the future like recovery expectation.
Yeah. So in the quantitative part, in the quantitative part, we did use the CDS spread to discipline the parameters. But I guess your question is whether this model is the correct model to estimate, right? Whether this kind of total default is the
I was just wondering like when the state government default, like cash, they have some like future cash flow like in their pocket. So there are some like static like way to collect these like cash, but there are also like some like dynamic ways to collect cash for future to repay. Then I'm just like wondering how these like defaults work in these like environments. From the corporate finance perspective. I'm outside.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I need to think more about that. Right? There's always an issue about whether the model is the correct model, especially when it comes to quantitative work. And on the other hand, we don't want to go too far and to complicate the setting. All right. So for the balanced budget, so we follow the literature that models the requirement as as follows: the government income must be sufficient to cover the spending and the interest payment. Okay, so this is the government, government income in our model, the tax revenue, and here we, the government makes the investment decisions, so we put the investment on the right hand side, and this part, right? So this part is the promised interest payments. Okay. Again, in the long-term case. So if we combine this this definition of balanced budget rule as well as the previous government budget constraint, you will get this inequality. Okay. And again, a simple way to look at this is to assume p is equal to 1. Right? So that's the short-term case. And if p is equal to 1, this part is gone, right? And these two are cancelled. Basically, it's equivalent to b is greater than b prime, meaning that you cannot increase your debt. And this is exactly the same as what this paper has shown. Right? So they have a 1-period debt, and that is their constraint. So because we are consistent, so I think it's probably fine. All right. So the next, let me skip this one, is to calibrate the model to Illinois, because Illinois is a state that has a pretty bad financial condition. Give some facts here. Thanks. And also, coincidentally, the CDS spread for Illinois is much higher than for other states. Okay. So then the primary question is, what if they impose the balanced budget rule? What will happen to financing cost, debt burden, welfare, etc.? We find this to be a very cool state to look at. Of course, you can calibrate to other states. Okay, I just want to find the, because I said that we look at the CDS square. Yeah, the mean of the square. So that's part of the moment that we talked about. So the price function. So here we plot the spreads at different different state of the economy when productivity is low, medium, or high. We find that so first of all, as that goes up, right, the spread goes up. That's standard. And also as productivity goes, if you compare vertically, higher productivity is associated with lower net, lower spread, right? So A1 has low productivity, high spread. And when it comes to capital levels, right, higher capital, right, K3 is associated with the lower spread. Right? So those are the kind of standard in the literature. Now, this one is quite interesting. This looks at the impact of a BBR. So basically, compare the spread with the BBR and without BBR and calculate the spread gap. So first of all, it's this positive, right? Meaning that if you impose a BBR, that will reduce the spread, right? So this is the spread minus spread BBR. So it's positive, meaning that with BBR, the spread is lower. And the difference, right, between, or the impact of BBR on borrowing costs is higher when that goes up. Right? As that becomes higher. It also becomes higher as the economy becomes worse. So, when there's a lower productivity, it has a higher spread gap than with a higher productivity. Meaning that if you impose a BBR, you better do that when the debt level is high and when the economy is bad. Okay. So similar for the capital stack. Okay. So that's what this picture shows. And then for this one, we also plot the next period debt as a function of this period debt, and next period capital as this period capital as this period debt. It's quite interesting. So there seems to be a change over time. So as that level is very low, right? A BBR lowers debt and investment. So if you compare this, this is the dashed line is with BBR, and this blue line is without BBR, right? So if you impose that, when that level is very low, it reduces debt. Right? That's kind of intuitive. You just tie the hands and you cannot borrow too much. But when that level becomes high, the scenario in which there is a BBR is even associated with a lower level of debt. So that's, sorry, a higher level, with BBR higher level. So why is that the case? Because, as we said, the impact of BBR on spread is more pronounced when that level is high. So the interest rate effect is stronger as that level is high. So if you impose a BBR when that level is high, lower interest rate, you tend to borrow. Okay. So that's very important. And it also speaks to our main mechanism, which is the financing cost. And similarly for the capital, it's kind of similar. Okay. All right. So then we look at the dynamic impacts of BBR. Basically, we simulate the economy. Again, using the Illinois calibrated parameters, we allow so first of all, there's no BBR for several periods. And then in year one, we introduce a balanced budget rule and see what will happen in the long run. So when it comes to spread, the threat immediately falls dramatically, right? And then stays at very low levels. So that's the immediate impact on financing cost. And for debt, there's a more gradual decline, right? The debt to GDP ratio gradually declines over the years. And the same for debt to tax revenue ratio. If we look at the interest, right, that's what we call the debt burden. So debt times the interest rate. It also decreases more gradually over time. So here's the change for welfare. As I said at the introduction, previously, for on impact of the introduction of the PBR, welfare decreases. Again, the intuition is that you tie the hands of the government's fiscal capacity, so which is bad. So you impose additional constraint, that's not good. Right? But then over time, you start to observe positive welfare change starting from year 3, and then it goes up and down, but it's positive. Okay. So then that intuition is that the benefits on the government balance sheet really kicks in. Right? That burden is much lower. It's cheaper to finance, and that's beneficial to the economy. Okay.
And how should I read the number? That's an 82% decline or a 0.82%?
It's a percent.
So it's a minus 0.82% decline in welfare.
Yes. Yes.
So the gains are not very big or small in either case when you look at them, right?
No. So if you think about in the business cycle literature,
yeah,
the welfare cost of a business cycle is actually smaller than it. So, I mean, that's typical.
So we should just not care about the welfare cost of business cycle.
No.
So, in other words, it's comparable to those numbers, right? So this is actually not small.
That is not small because I guess it's consumption equivalent welfare. So it represents like an increase of 0.1. It will be like the household consumes 0.1 more every period.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is small, but it is.
Yeah.
But it is.
I guess more interesting is this kind of decrease and then
change around basically. Yeah.
This is really helpful in awareness. So let me wrap up.
Just a question. Here there is nothing about optimal rule, right?
No.
Because it is kind of weird that the debt is going down, especially when you have access to better borrowing conditions, right? Because if the borrowing cost is lower, then I will expect I can issue not more debt, but at least the same that I was issuing previously and just roll over the debt because the costs are decreasing, no?
Yeah, so there are really two forces here, right? So one is that of course the fiscal rule, right? The other one is as the previous figure illustrates, the impact of lower interest rates like that. So somehow we find that here there's a consistent decline in debt.
Because, for example, in year 1,
yeah,
the debt is 9, but you are already competing with your fiscal rule, right? There.
Yeah.
And then in the other periods, of course, you are competing with the fiscal rule, but if you have lower borrowing cost, I mean, the optimal thing to do is actually, just keep rolling the debt at 9 points of GDP, for example, no?
Mm.
And then you can use the resources, either investment or consumption.
Yeah.
Paying all your debt is never optimal, no?
Yeah. That's a good point. I think here, there's a slight increase.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of reflects that lower cost, and then continues to decline
can be optimistic and think that GDP increase. Because even if that stays the same, if GDP does it, so more better economic conditions.
Yeah, that's right. So the GDP is also part of the so it's not that straightforward to tell, you know, a more complete story when you have GDP. But I think we should probably look at that and GDP separately. All right, so let me jump to the concluding parts. So basically what we do is that first we construct a new data set to better identify or to better make the link between balanced budget rule and government financing costs using cross-state variation. And we find that imposing BBR would lower financing cost and default risk. Okay. And then when it comes to the quantitative parts, we find that the impact can be stronger when the government is more impacted or the economy is worse. So I think this has implications for policy. Right? If you want to do this, you probably want to start with this with the regions or countries that is really in trouble. And the axis also shows that imposing balanced budget rule would significantly lower the debt burden, lower the financing cost, and improve welfare in the longer term. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're already 5 minutes late. I think for people here, if we have questions, we can do it outside with a coffee and snacks. And for people online, see you next week.